I should be clear. In criticizing Islam, I'm not criticizing all Muslims. I mean, there are Muslims who don't take the doctrine very seriously. There are Muslims who don't read the Quran with any attention.
Same thing in every religion.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. But Islam is at a very different moment in its history. And it's as though we're encountering the Christians of the 14th century, armed with 21st century weapons. We have a real problem with Islam, and it's not an accident that we're not having this conversation about the Amish or Quakers or Jains or even Buddhists. I mean, there are ideas have consequences, and the idea that you can get to paradise by dying in defense of the faith, in fact, dying in defense of the faith is the best thing that can possibly happen to you. That is a mainstream notion in Islam.
Is there any lesson in how?
I think we should address this point because there's a yawning chasm of nihilism waiting us if we don't seal it up. The idea that there's this opposition to speak rationally. Yeah.
Winding chasm of nihilism.
There are many justifications for madness have been coming out of that hole. This opposition between reason and everything else, I think, is fundamentally spurious. I think this idea that there's love on the one hand and then the cool rationality of science that's just all clatter and clockwork and soulless, this is a false dichotomy, and it's a dichotomy that is pervasive in the culture. You can't I can't tell you how many times I get on the radio and someone says, "Scientifically prove to me that you love your wife." As though that were just the knockdown argument of all time against reason and in support of faith. There's nothing irrational in principle about love. I mean, it is rational to value love. It is rational to try to recognize that it is one of our most cherished experiences, and then to try to live a life that maximizes it. Understanding love at the level of the brain is not going to deflate its importance for us. And the fact that we can understand the molecular constituents of chocolate doesn't make us not want to eat chocolate. I mean, these are different scales of interaction with the world. And so it's not a matter of only being coldly calculating in our approach to life. But where we have to call a spade is in gratuitous claims to certainty about invisible realities and the moral structure to the universe, about a God who so hates homosexuality that he will whip up tsunamis in defense of chaste heterosexual people. I mean, this is a vision of life that is animating millions and millions of our neighbors, and we have been cowed into not criticizing it. And to pick up what Pat Churchland said, this job is not best done by scientists. We need from 100 sides, culture at large, to just make it fundamentally embarrassing to hold these kinds of certainties. We live in a country where 90% of people believe in a biblical God. I think I'm destined to offend some of you here. I want to assure you that's not the point. It's not the point of my being here. It's not the point of my writing my books. I'm not being deliberately provocative. I'm simply extremely worried about the role that religion is playing in our world. I think religion is the most divisive and dangerous ideology that we have ever produced. And what's more, it's the only ideology that is systematically protected from criticism, both from within and without. It remains taboo. I mean, you can criticize someone's beliefs really on any subject, but it remains taboo to criticize their beliefs about God. And I think we're paying an extraordinary price for maintaining this taboo.
And that when you have a more literate, and particularly scientifically literate public, I happen to believe that it will be much more difficult for a lot of the things that you fear and I fear to happen.
Right. Well, I agree. Let me just say, however, that I'm not... The basis for being totally sanguine on that front is rather narrow when you notice people like Francis Collins. I mean, how much more science does Francis Collins need to have on board before he doubts that Jesus is the Son of God, likely to return to save humanity? I mean, this is, as many of you, I think, know, he's written this book, The Language of God. It purports to reconcile evangelical Christianity with the last 50 years of molecular biology. When you get to the point in the book where he had his doubts about Jesus removed, you come upon a passage, not the anthropic principle and other things are in there, but when you get to the nuts and bolts of why he's sure of Jesus, you get to a moment where he was hiking in the Cascade Mountains and came upon a frozen waterfall. it was beautiful. He fell to his knees in the dewy grass and gave himself to Christ. Now, I would argue that if a frozen waterfall can testify to the truth of Christian doctrine, it can testify to anything. And this is not scientific thinking, and it gets a pass. I mean, it is impolitic for me to perhaps even be saying this. And I would love to be in dialogue with Francis directly about this, but it is this kind of thinking comes at a great price in our society, because it is now imagined that you can be rigorously scientific on every question and be certain, based on a frozen waterfall, that Jesus is the sole savior of humanity. And I think that's quite dangerous when we have a president who uses his first veto to block stem cell research, for instance.
What if someone comes forward and says, well, I'm sorry, but that's not how I choose to think about water? What if someone says, I'm a biblical chemist and I read in Genesis 1 that God created water before he created light, which in fact it says in Genesis 1. So therefore there were no stars to fuse hydrogen and helium into heavier elements like oxygen. So there would have been no oxygen to put in the water. So God either there's no oxygen in water, or God made special oxygen. And I don't believe he'd do that, because that would be biblically inelegant. Okay. What could we possibly do with such a person? Okay. All we can do is appeal to scientific values. Okay. And if a person doesn't share those values, the conversation is over. Okay. We must appeal to the value of understanding the world, the value of evidence, in this case, some hundreds of years of evidence in chemistry, the value of logical consistency. Much of what we believe about the world is predicated on the validity of our beliefs about the structure of water. If someone doesn't value evidence, what evidence are you going to provide that proves they should value it? If someone doesn't value logic, what logical argument could you invoke to prove that they should value logic? Speaking more generally, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are founded on the claim that the Bible and the Quran were dictated by the creator of the universe. I mean, there is a creator, there is a personal God, and he occasionally writes books. He doesn't code software, he doesn't produce films. Mel Gibson's claim to have been toiling all the while under the influence of the Holy Spirit, I think, is probably an exception here. But in any case, God is principally an author of books. And this idea has achieved credibility because the contents of these books are deemed to be so profound that they could not possibly have been produced by the human mind. Please consider how implausible this is. Consider how differently we treat scientific texts and discoveries. In the year 1665, beginning in the summer of 1665, Isaac Newton went into isolation to dodge the outbreak of plague that was incidentally laying waste to the pious men and women of England. And when he had emerged from his solitude, he had invented the integral and differential calculus. He had discovered the laws of universal gravitation and motion. He had set the field of optics on its foundation. Now, many scientists think this is the most awe-inspiring display of human intelligence in the history of human intelligence. And yet no one is tempted to ascribe this to divine agency. We know that these accomplishments were affected by a mortal, and a very unpleasant mortal at that. And yet literally billions of us deem the contents of the Bible and the Quran so profound as to rule out the possibility of terrestrial authorship. Now, given the depth and breadth of human achievement, I think this is almost a miracle in its own right. I mean, it seems to me a miraculous misappropriation of awe. I mean, it took 2 centuries of continuous human ingenuity on the part of some of the smartest people who have ever lived to significantly improve upon Newton's achievement. How difficult would it be to improve the Bible? I mean, anyone in this tent could improve this supposedly inerrant text scientifically, historically, ethically, spiritually, in a matter of moments. Well, I think again, it comes down to specific ideas and their specific consequences. So there are other variables in play on many of these questions, but when you ask, why, just let me take the most illiberal example we have currently. Why is the Islamic State doing the specific things they're doing? Why are they throwing gays off of rooftops? Why are they crucifying people? Why are they taking sex slaves? You can draw a straight line from those specific practices. I mean, it's exactly like asking, why do Catholics eat a cracker during the Mass, and say something about the miracle of transubstantiation. I mean, it is doctrine in practice. It's not purely a matter of politics and economics. There are specific versions of Islam. The political version we call Islamism for the purposes of this book, and I think that's a very useful term going forward, which are a kind of recipe for intolerance and in its various forms, whether it's intolerance towards women or gays or free speech or civil society as we know it. It is separable from the other conditions on the ground. You can be very wealthy. I mean, so by your analysis, it is an absolute mystery why someone getting his medical degree in the UK, a third-generation British citizen, would go off to join ISIS and think it's the best use of his time to go saw the heads off of journalists and aid workers, right? And just to realize that the sawing the heads off of journalists and aid workers, that's not their My Lai massacre over there. That's not what some specific individuals did in extremis and then had to apologize for to their culture. That is their outreach to the rest of the community. That is their effort to put their best theological foot forward to the rest of the world. And some number of people find that incredibly attractive. And it's not an accident, because you can go back to the texts and cash out those behaviors. And that's the problem we have to be honest about and deal with. And
we can laugh at a belief in Zeus, but we can't laugh at a belief in Allah or the biblical God, even here. And I just want to point out that, I mean, our situation is so uncanny. I mean, we have a world that has been shattered by literature, and I think we have to marshal an emotional response that the same response we would have if we woke up in a world tomorrow where, all the violence in the Middle East, all the bloodletting, all the wars and threat of future war was born of rival interpretations of the plays of Shakespeare, where the Jews like King Lear and the Muslims like Hamlet, and they're willing to blow themselves up in crowds of children over the difference. Okay, that seems like an impossibly bizarre world to live in, and yet that is exactly the world we are living in. And if we could come face to face with that strangeness, I think we wouldn't be wasting much time wondering about whether there is a conflict between religion and science.
many people claim to find it impossible to believe or to imagine that they won't exist after death. Just try it for a second. I mean, you imagine that everyone in Paris right now is getting along fine without all of us. I mean, none of us are in Paris. We are really, really materially absent from whatever is going on in every other city on this planet right now. You were absent for all of human history before your birth. The idea that you simply can't imagine not existing after death is really kind of just for lack of trying, I think.
When the stakes are high, we have a choice between conversation and violence. Maybe both interpersonally and at the level of nations. We have a choice between conversation and war, essentially. And what I see religious faith doing, what dogma does intrinsically, and religious dogma especially, is it stops the conversation. I mean, dogma are those beliefs that you have taken off the table, that are no longer there to be revised through new evidence and new argument. And these are the dogmas, these are the beliefs around which people are making their strongest claims about us, them, in-group, out-group, sort of tribalism. And so I think the only thing that guarantees that our collaboration with one another is truly open-ended is a willingness to have our beliefs about the world and our behavior revised through conversation, and that is science broadly construed.
So you are advocating the introduction of reason and argument into
Absolutely.
into